I never expected anything unusual from work, until two women brushed against me one evening, lingered just a little too close, and whispered words that would change everything. "You belong with us." Work had always felt like a place of routine to me. The kind of place where the days blend together, one meeting after another, the endless tap of keyboards filling the silence in between. Safe. Predictable. And, honestly, a little lonely. But sometimes, in the middle of that ordinary hum, something, or someone, stands out. For me, it was them. Two women who carried themselves with a kind of grace that turned even the simplest walk across the office into something worth noticing. They weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Confidence just followed them, like a soft shadow. I remember the first time I realized it wasn't just me watching them, they were watching me too. It was subtle. A glance that lasted a second too long across the conference table. A smile that seemed warmer than what the situation called for. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing. But when you feel something stir inside you that quickly, you know it isn't nothing. That afternoon, the office was quieter than usual. Most people had already left for lunch. I stayed behind to finish some notes, head bent over my desk. And that's when it happened. One of them walked past me, closer than she needed to, and her shoulder brushed lightly against mine. Just a passing touch, gone in a moment. But the strange thing about small touches is how big they feel when you weren't expecting them. My skin lit up, the sensation lingering long after she'd already moved on. I looked up, and she gave me this knowing little smile. Not flirtatious, not obvious, but knowing. Later that same day, I caught the other woman glancing at me from across the room. She pretended to be focused on a file in her hands, but her eyes kept finding me in these quick, quiet intervals. When she finally realized I'd noticed, she didn't look away like most people would. Instead, she held my gaze for just a second longer than what could be called professional, before lowering her eyes with the faintest curve of a smile. In that moment, I felt caught in something I couldn't name. A current, maybe, pulling me toward them without warning. The sounds of the office came back to me slowly. Phones ringing, someone laughing in a far-off corridor, the familiar rhythm of fingers tapping against a desk. And yet, everything felt different now. The air carried a kind of weight, charged with something I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. It's strange, how quickly your world can shift. How an ordinary day, filled with ordinary moments, can tilt on its axis with just a brush of a shoulder, or the way someone looks at you when they think no one else is paying attention. I didn't know it then, but those small moments were only the beginning. The beginning of a closeness I never saw coming, and a confession I'll never forget. It's funny how, once you notice something, you start seeing it everywhere. After that day, I couldn't help but feel their presence differently. Not in an obvious way, there were no dramatic gestures or bold words, but in the smaller things. A pause in a hallway conversation, a look shared across a crowded room, a quietness that somehow included me. One evening, I stayed late at the office. Most people had already gone home, the overhead lights switched off in half the rooms, leaving the place softened in shadow. It was just me, a cup of cold coffee, and the glow of my computer screen. Or so I thought. When I looked up, she was there, one of them. Sitting a few desks away, papers spread out before her, hair tucked loosely behind her ear. The kind of sight that could make the sterile office feel warmer without changing a single thing. We exchanged a smile, the kind that acknowledges both of us should have been home hours ago. And somehow, without really planning it, I found myself moving over to her side of the room. We didn't say much at first. Just the occasional comment about how late it had gotten, or how the work never seemed to end. But our chairs ended up closer than they needed to be, angled toward one another. At one point, she laughed, soft and unguarded, and in the middle of it, her hand rested lightly on my forearm. Only for a second. But it was enough to make the moment linger. I remember the warmth of her touch, the way her fingers pressed just lightly enough to let me know it wasn't accidental. My chest tightened, not in discomfort, but in the sharp awareness of how near she was. Later that week, it was the other woman who startled me. I was buried in work at my desk when she walked by, pausing just behind me. She leaned close enough to glance at what I was typing, her hand brushing the back of my chair as she commented softly, "That looks better than what I managed." It was such a casual thing to say, but the way her hand lingered, just a touch of fingertips against the chair's fabric, made my breath catch. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, warm and elegant, nothing like the artificial air of the office. She didn't stay long. She gave me a quiet smile, one corner of her mouth lifting, and then she moved on as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had happened. The warmth of her touch followed me, the sound of her voice carried in my ears long after she left the room. By then, I was certain it wasn't my imagination. These weren't accidents. They were choices, gentle, careful, unspoken choices. And though none of us said a word about it, something between us was shifting. Slowly, deliberately, and in a way I couldn't stop thinking about. It was proximity. Subtle, unspoken, but heavy with meaning. And I realized. I didn't want it to stop. I think the real turning point came the evening they asked me out. Not on a date, not in any way that could be labeled or explained so simply, it was just an invitation. A suggestion that I shouldn't spend another night alone in my apartment after a long day of work. It happened on a Thursday. The office was emptying out, that familiar shuffle of footsteps heading toward the elevators. I was packing my bag when I felt someone approach. One of them leaned casually against the edge of my desk, arms crossed, a smile tugging at her lips. "You always stay later than everyone else," she said. "Don't you ever give yourself a break?" Before I could answer, the other appeared beside her, holding her coat over one arm. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between curiosity and amusement. "We were going for a drink," she said. "You should come." It was spoken lightly, as if it didn't matter to them whether I said yes or no. But the way they stood there, together, expectant, told me it did matter. For a moment, I hesitated. I thought about how it might look, about the lines we all pretended to keep between work and everything else. But then I looked at them, two women who seemed so certain, so inviting without a word of pressure, and I realized I wanted to be there. With them. So I said yes. The bar they chose wasn't crowded or noisy. It was the kind of place tucked away on a side street, where soft music played and the lights were warm, spilling golden over polished wood. We found a small corner table, just the three of us, and for the first time, it felt like the world outside didn't matter. At first, the talk stayed safe, how the week had been, a funny story from a meeting. But gradually, the conversation shifted. The drinks loosened something unspoken between us. One of them leaned closer, her chin resting lightly on her hand as she asked me about my life outside of work. Not just the usual questions, but things like what I dreamed of when I was younger, what I thought I might be doing if I hadn't ended up here. Her eyes didn't waver from mine, as if she wasn't just asking for the sake of conversation, she genuinely wanted to know. The other shared stories of her own, moments from her past that were surprisingly tender. She spoke about times she had felt invisible, despite seeming so sure of herself now. There was a vulnerability in her voice I hadn't heard before, and it made me ache to listen. And then, in between the laughter and the long pauses, there were the smaller things. The way one of them brushed her hair back and leaned close enough that I felt the warmth of her arm against mine. The way the other, mid-conversation, touched my hand lightly to emphasize a point, her fingertips lingering just a fraction too long. It was in those gestures, more than the words, that the night came alive. I sat there, caught between them, feeling a closeness I hadn't expected. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't forced, it just was. Natural, like something waiting to happen. And as the night stretched on, I realized I didn't want it to end. It's strange how quickly strangers can turn into confidants. A week earlier, these women had been co-workers, respected, admired from a careful distance. But that night at the bar, with soft light spilling across the table and the world outside forgotten, something shifted. The walls we all carried, the ones that kept everything neat and professional, quietly fell away. The conversation slowed. We weren't laughing anymore, not like we had earlier. Instead, their words began to carry weight. One of them, the one who usually seemed unshakable at work, leaned back in her chair with a sigh. She swirled the last sip of wine in her glass and said softly, "Sometimes I wonder if people ever really see me. They see the version of me that gets things done, the one who never falters. But that isn't all of me." Her voice trailed off, and I could tell she hadn't meant to say so much. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But then I realized I didn't need the perfect words. I just needed to listen. The other reached across the table, resting her hand over her friend's for a moment, a quiet reassurance, tender and natural. She turned to me then, her eyes searching. "Do you ever feel that way?" she asked. I nodded, almost before I could think. "All the time," I admitted. Being the youngest in the room, it's like people only see me as inexperienced or unprepared. Like I have to prove myself twice as much, just to be taken seriously. Sometimes it feels like no one really knows me, just the version of me that fits their idea. The words surprised me as they came out. I hadn't planned to share them. But the truth had been sitting on my chest for so long, it felt like a relief to finally let it out. There was a pause then, not an uncomfortable one, but the kind of silence that holds more meaning than words. Both of them looked at me, not with pity, but with understanding. And in that moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't expected. Her hand moved from her friend's to mine, resting gently on top, her thumb brushing lightly against my knuckles. It wasn't bold, not a declaration, but it was real. The kind of touch that says, "I hear you. I'm with you." At the same time, the other leaned closer, her knee brushing against mine under the table. She didn't move it away. Instead, it stayed there, a quiet connection that grew warmer by the second. The three of us sat like that, suspended in a moment that felt both fragile and unbreakable. The bar around us faded, conversations blurred into background noise, music drifted like smoke through the air, but none of it touched us. What mattered was the honesty, the small cracks we had all revealed, the closeness we had chosen in that moment. And though no one said it aloud, I knew. Something between us had changed forever when we finally stepped out of the bar. The night had already settled deep around the city. The streets were quieter, the air cool and edged with that faint bite that comes just before autumn fully arrives. The world outside felt hushed, as though it was making room for whatever was unfolding between us. We walked together, side by side, our footsteps soft against the pavement. I expected them to peel off in their own directions, to wave goodnight with polite smiles. But they didn't. Instead, they stayed with me. One on my left, one on my right. Close enough that I could feel their presence even without looking, like warmth pressing in from both sides. At first, we talked lightly, as though trying to keep things normal. Comments about the neighborhood, jokes about how late it had gotten, little threads of conversation to cover the silence. But soon, the words thinned out. The pauses grew longer. What filled the air wasn't awkwardness, though, it was tension. Quiet, electric, undeniable. At some point, one of them slipped her arm through mine. The gesture was so natural, I almost didn't notice it until the weight of her hand rested gently against my sleeve. My heart picked up, steady and strong, as though it had been waiting for exactly that touch. The other laughed at something I said, soft and genuine, and in her laughter she reached out, her hand brushing my shoulder as though it had always belonged there. She left it there for a moment longer than casual. Long enough to make me aware of how deliberate it was. And so there I was, walking the quiet streets with both of them beside me, their warmth anchoring me in place. I felt caught between them, but not in a way that demanded a choice. It wasn't rivalry. It was something else, something that felt strangely whole, like they had both decided, silently, that there was room for me with them. The night air pressed cool against my skin, but it didn't matter. Their closeness was enough to keep me warm. Every time our coats brushed together, every time our steps aligned, the energy between us deepened. I didn't say much. I was too aware of everything, the rhythm of their breathing, the way their hands touched me lightly but firmly, as if to remind me I wasn't dreaming. My chest felt tight, full, like there was something just about to break open. When we reached the street where I lived, I slowed without meaning to. I think I just didn't want the walk to end. And neither did they. We stopped outside my building. For a moment, none of us moved. The city hummed faintly in the distance, but here, on this quiet street, the world had narrowed down to the three of us. Her arms stayed linked with mine. The other's hand lingered on my shoulder. Neither of them let go. And in that charged, suspended moment, I knew, something was about to be said that would change everything. We stood there at the edge of my doorway, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The street around us was quiet, a faint glow from the street lamps painting everything in a soft, golden hush. Their closeness was all I could register, the warmth of her arms still linked through mine, the gentle weight of the other's hand resting on my shoulder. It should have been a simple goodnight, but it wasn't. It was something heavier, more fragile, as though none of us wanted to break whatever invisible thread was binding us together. I tried to speak first, fumbling for something casual. "Thank you for tonight," I said, my voice lower than I intended. I didn't realize how much I needed it. One of them tilted her head, studying me in a way that made me feel exposed, not in a bad way, but as though she could see past all the versions of me I tried to present to the world. "You don't realize it, do you?" she said softly. My chest tightened. "Realize what?" She smiled, but it wasn't the playful, distant smile I'd seen at work. It was gentler, carrying something rawer beneath it. "How natural you are with us. Like you've always been meant to be here, in this space between us." Before I could respond, the other leaned closer, her voice low, just for me. There was something almost teasing in her tone, but the sincerity underneath it made my breath catch. "You belong with us." The words hit me harder than I expected. They weren't dramatic or rehearsed, they were simple, honest, almost inevitable. And yet, in hearing them, I felt something inside me shift. Belonging. It wasn't about romance, not in the way people usually defined it. It wasn't about rebellion or crossing lines. It was about the way their eyes held mine in that moment, steady and unafraid. About the way their hands stayed on me, grounding me, asking me without words not to step away. I realized then that this wasn't just a fleeting attraction or some passing curiosity. It was something deeper. Something that felt rare. My throat tightened with all the things I wanted to say, but couldn't. So instead, I just let the silence speak for me. I turned slightly, letting my free hand brush against hers, the one still holding my arm. Her fingers responded instantly, curling around mine with a quiet certainty. The other shifted closer, her shoulder brushing against me, her eyes never leaving mine. There was no rush, no urgency. Just that steady, deliberate closeness that told me they weren't asking for answers tonight. They were offering something. And for the first time, I let myself believe it. The night air was cool against my skin, but between them, I felt steady, warm, anchored. Those words, "You belong with us," echoed in my chest like a promise I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how we'd explain it to anyone else. All I knew was that in that moment, with their hands on me and their eyes holding mine, I believed them. I belonged. I don't know which of us moved first, but instead of saying goodnight, instead of letting the moment dissolve into uncertainty, we all seemed to make the same quiet choice. I opened the door, and without a word, they followed me inside. The apartment was dim, lit only by the glow of a single lamp in the corner. I set down my keys, suddenly aware of how small and ordinary my space was compared to the weight of what was happening. But they didn't seem to notice, or maybe they did and it simply didn't matter. They slipped off their coats, draping them casually over the back of a chair, and suddenly the room felt warmer, fuller, alive in a way it hadn't before. I asked if they wanted tea, partly out of politeness, partly just to steady myself with something normal. They smiled, both of them, as though they'd been expecting me to say exactly that. While the water boiled, we moved around each other in the kitchen, our steps brushing close, shoulders grazing, small touches that felt unspoken but deliberate. When we finally settled in the living room, mugs of steaming tea in our hands, it wasn't conversation that mattered anymore. It was the silence, comfortable and whole, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. One of them sat close enough that her knee pressed lightly against mine. The other leaned against the armrest, but halfway through a laugh, she shifted closer, draping her arm across the back of the couch until her fingers rested lightly on my shoulder. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no promises we weren't ready to make. But in those small gestures, the brush of a knee, the weight of a hand, the warmth of a shared glance, everything was said. I found myself watching them more than speaking, caught by the way the lamplight softened their faces, by the ease in their eyes now that the world outside was shut away. They didn't look like coworkers anymore. They didn't look like untouchable figures who had once seemed so far ahead of me. They looked like two women who had chosen to let me in, and in that choice, given me something I hadn't realized I'd been searching for, a place to belong. At some point, my words slipped out almost without thought. "I think you're right," I said quietly, my voice steady but low. They both turned toward me. "I do belong with you." For a moment, none of us moved. And then, slowly, one leaned her head against my shoulder. The other rested her hand gently over mine, her thumb tracing a soft, reassuring line across my skin. It wasn't passion that filled me then, it was peace. A deep, quiet sense of rightness, as though all the searching, all the second-guessing, had led me here, to this couch, this night, these two women who saw me for exactly who I was. And in that stillness, I finally understood. Belonging wasn't something you fought for or earned, it was something you found, when the right people decided to hold you close. That night, I was exactly where I was meant to be. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more slow-burn age gap romances. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever felt that quiet moment of belonging with someone unexpected?